In the year 2016, I got it into my head that I wanted to pursue Italian citizenship by descent, or so-called Jure Sanguinis citizenship. And in this video, I'm going to talk about the incredible 10-year odyssey of pursuing this goal. And even though the pursuit isn't quite over, I want to pause here and tell the story because it's an incredible story. And it's a great story. And I also want to share my evolving thoughts on expatriating to Italy or to the EU in general, in light of everything that I've gone through in this process and everything that I've learned. So, when I was originally thinking about moving to Italy, it kind of started just because my wife and I liked Italy, and we kind of had a dream, wouldn't it be nice to go retire there someday? It seemed kind of like a magical thing to do. And as the years wound on, another reason became more and more prevalent, and that reason, of course, is that the United States is just becoming more and more unlivable. It's just completely, normal people are just unable to afford the cost of living in the United States, and it's only going to get worse. There isn't a single thing going on in the government that is going to make anything better, so it became more and more urgent to figure out this problem. But going all the way back to the very beginning, my interest in the citizenship, it really happened by accident. I had no idea that Jure Sanguinis citizenship even existed. All I was doing was poking around over there because I knew my family on my mom's side, we had Italian heritage, and I knew I had a bunch of kind of distant cousins who were living in Italy, and I kind of had this kind of idle, naive thought of, maybe the presence of those cousins would make it easier for me to get permanent residency in Italy. Right? It was that naive, actually, coming at it. But as soon as I started just looking into things very generally, I quickly discovered Jure Sanguinis citizenship, and I also quickly realized that I probably had a case through my grandfather's father, my great-grandfather who came from Sicily. I immediately started doing the research. First with the census records, I figured out I probably had an unbroken bloodline. And then I undertook the two big things, right? I ordered the naturalization certificates from the US government, and at the same time, I found a guy in Sicily to go hunting for all the live birth records from Italy that I was going to need. Luckily, all my records were in Sicily, and so he went around and he was able to find two of the three. He was able to find my great-grandmother's birth certificate and their marriage certificate, but he was not able to find my great-grandfather's birth certificate, which in some ways is the most important document of all. However, in researching things, I realized that it probably wasn't going to be too much of a big deal because the Italian consulates in the United States, they were basically accepting the baptism certificate in lieu of the birth certificate. And the reason they do that, of course, is that these documents are so old, documents disappear, things got bombed in World War II, right? Stuff isn't around, and Italy is such a Catholic country that the birth certificate and the quality of the records that are kept of baptism certificates, rather, was basically equivalent to the birth certificate. So I hired the guy again to go look for the baptism certificate, and he found it. It was kind of a cool story because the church had moved all of their really ancient records, like from the 1800s. They had moved it to some strange facility in the hills of Sicily, and he had to wait a couple months to get access to this facility to try to look for the document. Anyway, long story short, he found them, and so I had all the core documents from Italy, and it took about 6 months. And that's about how long it takes for the government to come up with the C file number on a naturalization certificate request. So that came back, and it turned out that my great-grandfather had naturalized well after having my grandfather as a child. And so I had an unbroken bloodline, and by Jure Sanguinis I qualified for Italian citizenship, and all I had to do was get it recognized. Now, since things were looking pretty good, I started collecting all the other documents that I needed, which of course is just the chain of documents that links my great-grandfather to me. And here I hit my first hurdle. And that was that I discovered that the Italian consulate in New York City was not accepting the baptism certificate in lieu of the death certificate. And this was really hard for me to understand at the time. And it really, for the first time, I kind of got a glimpse of how things actually work in Italy. Because what in fact was happening is that the Italian consulates, they all kind of function as their own independent fiefdom, out of the Middle Ages or something, right? And they're all just make up all their own rules. And so none of the other consulates were doing this, but the New York consulate had just decided, perhaps somewhat capriciously, to not accept the baptism certificates. So at that point I hired lawyers. And when I asked my lawyers about this, they were like, "This is Italy. Everybody does anything they want," right? That was kind of their explanation of what was going on. So I retained lawyers who were experts in Jure Sanguinis citizenship, and they got to work coming up with an alternate plan. And the alternate plan was as follows: since my mother was not under the jurisdiction of the New York consulate, she in fact lived under the jurisdiction of the Philadelphia consulate. The plan was to send my mom through first, where there would be no trouble using the baptism certificate. And then once she was through, I would go through at the New York City consulate. So I had booked an appointment for June of 2019 at the New York City consulate. Now that was, well, the time I booked it, that was a 2.5-year wait. And and so once this plan was hatched, my mother immediately went and booked her own appointment at the Philadelphia consulate. And she was actually able to get one much quicker. It was less than a year, the wait. Hers was in October of 2018. So in terms of the turnaround, it was a little bit close, and we felt a little bit nervous. But when we submitted for her at the Philadelphia consulate, they told us, it's taken about 3 months, for things to get back. You should hear in 3 months was what we were told. So so all well and good, we submitted, everything went pretty smoothly, and 3 months came and went, and we hadn't heard anything from the Philadelphia consulate. And I was getting nervous. My mom kept trying to contact them, but honestly, these consulates, it's almost impossible to even get people on the phone. If you do, you can't get them to be helpful. It's really, really difficult. So we just had no idea what was going on, and my appointment was approaching, and I had to cancel my June 2019 appointment, because I didn't have any word on my mom's submission. So at that point, I kind of just, went into a lull, a temporary lull, because, I didn't really know what to do. And eventually, my mom, kind of at the end of the year, she actually was able to get a hold of someone at the Philadelphia consulate who was useful. And they did some research, and they told her that, in fact, she had been made an Italian citizen in January of 2019, almost 3 months to the day from her submission. And apparently she just hadn't received the letter giving her official notice and giving her the official document that identified her as an Italian citizen. So this was like the first of 4 major heartbreaks in my long, tumultuous journey. If my mom had simply received the letter, I would have easily made my appointment in June 2019 at the Italian consulate in New York City, and I would be an Italian citizen now. But, that didn't happen. But we were really happy, of course, that my mom had gotten her citizenship, and she went and got her passport. And we started to look forward with some hope to, just rescheduling my appointment and moving forward. And of course, at that point, the pandemic hit and all the consulates were closed. Now, when the consulates started to reopen, again, they all just reopened in their own individual time. So it was, for the different consulates in the United States, it was anywhere from 1 to 2 years that they waited before they reopened. But the important thing to know from my story is that when they reopened, they all of a sudden were no longer accepting Jure Sanguinis citizenship applications. You could not book an appointment at all. And nobody knew why. There really wasn't anything official that had come out about this. They just weren't doing it. And I asked my lawyers. My lawyers had no idea what was going on. They said, no one knows what's happening. We just have to wait for these consulates to reopen. There's really nothing we can do. And so again, I was just kind of stuck. And at that point, obviously coming out of the pandemic, it was really traumatic, re-entering normal life. Everything had changed pretty much for the worst. And so it was pretty easy to just put all this stuff on the back burner for a couple years. Like I didn't know what to do, and I had bigger problems to face. However, in 2024, I started hearing about a new way to submit a Jure Sanguinis petition. And that was going through the courts in Italy. Now, there had always been a path to do this that was an alternative to the consulate route. And that path was you could go live in Italy. You could go over there and establish residency. And then, for a couple months or 3 months or whatever, you could push it through the Italian courts yourself, or maybe with the help of local lawyers. But of course, this was a difficult thing because, obviously this was really expensive. It was also really inconvenient, not the kind of thing that most people could do. You have to have the kind of work situation where you could just go live in another country, for months on end and carry this out. I certainly did not have that in my case. So that was never really something that I seriously considered, although I guess as a last resort we considered it. But however, this other route was as follows. It has to do with the way Jure Sanguinis citizenship, the way it actually, what it actually means in Italian law. And so the route was that you would basically go through the Italian courts, and you would issue a petition, but by way of a complaint against the consulates, because the consulates are supposed to provide this service. Because Jure Sanguinis citizenship, it's not that you can apply for citizenship. It's that you, in a sense, are one or have always been one since your birth, and you have the right to, have it officially recognized and become an official citizen. That's the way it existed in Italian law. And so if the consulates had just stopped doing this, then in a way people's rights were being violated, and so you had a path to push your petition directly through the Italian courts. And in this route, you didn't have to go live in Italy. That was kind of part of it. You were a person of Italian descent living in America. You have this right to go through the consulates. They aren't allowing that right, so you therefore have a way to use the Italian courts. So I had a little bit lost touch with my lawyers at the time, but I started looking into this alternate route, and there were various, like maybe fly-by-night things on the internet that were doing it. But I called my lawyers, and they were also doing this because, unsurprisingly, they just had tons of clients where their whole Jure Sanguinis petition process had just ground to a halt because of what the consulates had done. So they had gotten in the business of this alternate route of submitting petitions, and they had established contacts, legal contacts in Italy, partnering with law firms in Italy to be able to do this. So in talking with them, I decided to retain the lawyers yet again and pursue this path. Now, this meant that I had to recollect a bunch of documents. And I had to collect documents that I actually hadn't collected for my mom's submission. In particular, I had to collect death certificates for individuals who were obviously, not alive, right? If someone is 135 years old, like they're not going to be living, and the consulates, anyway, they didn't really require these death certificates in this case, and certainly my mom never submitted them. So the problem is that my key death certificates came from the state of Connecticut, and unlike every other state in the Union, the state of Connecticut takes 4 fucking months to process like any claim like this at all, for a simple claim for documents, 4 months. And I remember being nervous about this at the time because it was such a long wait and it seemed like an edge case. And it resulted in kind of a key moment where a decision had to be made, and my lawyers were split. The one lawyer felt that we probably didn't have to get the death certificates even for this Italian court's submission, but the other lawyer, the main lead lawyer, felt that, if we had a document, if it was possible to get it, we should present it. Because why on earth would we do anything else, right? We've come so long or so far. Why would we omit documents and risk just getting them rejected, like on the basis of a technicality or something like that? And so I decided to go with the advice of the lead lawyer, and that wound up being a critical error, actually. So I sat there waiting for the Connecticut death certificates, and sure enough, 4 months to the day, basically, those fuckers coughed up the damn death certificates, and everything else was ready, and the lawyer started preparing the petition. And then the third major blow to my hopes happened, and this was the big decree that came out from the Italian courts. Now, the decree, basically, it was the court saying that they wanted to, basically, for all intents and purposes, destroy Jure Sanguinis citizenship as a path by placing enormous restrictions on who could do it and who qualified. Now, there were all kinds of different restrictions that were out there and floated, but the main one was that they wanted to stop people from using great-grandparents in their petition. And this was very critical because this was the piece that killed Jure Sanguinis, basically, because people using their great-grandparents, these are the people who are tied through blood to the mass waves of Italian emigration out of Italy, to places like Argentina, Brazil, United States, and other places that happened in the late 19th century and the early 20th century. And so, by stopping that, it pretty much kills Jure Sanguinis. If you think about it, it would still be allowed for if you used your parents, but for someone whose parents were citizens and they weren't, if you just think about that, that's just like a totally bizarre edge case that is probably pretty rare, right? People that would really want to, claim their citizenship, they were going to be denied by this. Now, when the decree came out, the Italian courts had, I think, 3 months to translate this into legislation. And and there was a lot of pushback in Italy because immediately serious questions were raised as to the constitutionality of this, and it kind of it kind of links back to something I said earlier, which is that with Jure Sanguinis citizenship, it's like people they kind of are Italian citizens by blood, and what you're doing is just getting it recognized. So if they're going to suddenly say that, that somebody like me can no longer get my citizenship recognized, then in a sense they're kind of taking a right away from me that I had at birth, like a constitutional right. And so, that's like a pretty serious thing for Italy to do. And later on in this video, or perhaps it'll be in a subsequent follow-up video, I am going to talk about like why Italy is doing this and what the ramifications of this are, and what this means, for people moving to Italy. But for right now, in the context of this story at its current state, what it meant is that there was this big chaotic delay in Italy, and it gave my lawyers time to scramble and figure out what to do. And so basically, what they did is they just worked like dogs, and they figured out like what could be done. And in consultation with people on the ground in Italy, they were kind of figuring out what was happening and what kind of arguments could be made. And in the end, the argument, they did come up with an argument that seemed to be working in some parts of Italy. The argument was basically challenging the constitutionality of the decree and just submitting the petition basically as is. And again, like with the consulates, it was very much like like an example of like the chaos of Italy, right? The every region and every court and even every judge, right? They're like their own like feudal baron out of the Middle Ages, and like whatever. They make the law in their part of the land, and so they had to like go find, okay, which judges are open to these kinds of arguments and stuff like that. So they did that, and we went forward with this as the plan, and I got a hearing date for my petition, and that date was March of 2026, and so at this point, I was feeling pretty good despite everything. And as the date approached, about a week before my hearing, the Italian High Court issued an opinion that basically declared that there was no constitutionality issue with the decree, and that the whole trashing of Jure Sanguinis could go forward unimpeded. And So this was obviously devastating, but my lawyers felt that we were making arguments that were suitably different to the exact wording of what the High Court had put out, and they had had success in the court, and in fact the actual judge that was hearing my case, they had just a short time before, like other people had, their petitions had been granted, and so we decided to go forward with it. And basically we went forward with it, and the petition was denied. And so, you know, this is, in some ways, this is kind of the most heartbreaking of the four major blows, because like if my appointment had been just 1 week earlier, 1 week, it probably just would have sailed right through. But because it was after the decree, and even though there's like still a lot of legal rigmarole, you know, to do with this statement on the decree and everything, it didn't matter that, you know, the judge they weren't gonna cross the High Court on my behalf, and so it was just dead in the water. So, you know, this basically brings us up to the current moment. Now, I can appeal the decision, and my lawyers, at least preliminarily, they feel that there are some pretty serious grounds for an appeal. But I'm now like in another waiting game, because I can't appeal until I get the official written decision on my petition. I just got the answer. The answer was no, but I haven't gotten anything in writing. And it's been months, so for all I know, I'm gonna wait 3 months, 6 months, 9 months. God only knows how long I'm gonna have to wait for this written decision, and then I'll have to go through the decision process of, you know, do I want to do it, and do I want to hire the lawyers yet again to go through with this appeal? So, you know, in summary of this incredible odyssey that I have been through, if you think about like the incredible heartbreak and bad luck that I've been through. There were 4 instances where, you know, basically just fate just crushed my hopes, right? If my mom had just received the letter, if the consulates had just not decided willy-nilly to just stop doing this shit, if you know, if I had submitted before the decree came out, and any petition in progress before the decree came out was guaranteed to be grandfathered in going forward. So it would have just sailed through if I had just not waited for the state of Connecticut and submitted a couple weeks early. And then of course the last heartbreak is, you know, I was a week too late with my appointment, and so my hopes were crushed. So anyway, that is my incredibly sad but not quite yet concluded story on my quest for Italian citizenship by descent. So in the next video, I'm gonna talk a little bit about everything this crazy odyssey has taught me, and all the things that it made me think about in terms of, you know, important issues around, you know, picking Italy and trying to get citizenship through Italy, and also kind of entertaining the EU as a destination to be an expatriate American. And I hope to make this the first in a series of videos kind of chronicling my efforts to come up with a plan B to kind of retire outside of the United States. So if you enjoy this material, be sure to like and subscribe to the video, and stay tuned for part 2, where I talk about everything I've learned from this whole crazy Odyssey. Thanks for watching.